about a year ago, and I was heading into work. It was early, it was 7 a.m., and it was on the cusp of spring. It was a beautiful day, and I just happened across the most beautiful bouquet of flowers I had ever seen, and they were thrown away in a trash can. I couldn't believe it. It was absolutely stunning. And so I was sitting there and I was looking at these flowers and I was thinking, I have to save them. But the cherry blossoms, they were maybe 6 feet tall, right? There was no way I was going to get them to the office. And so I looked and there were some tulips scattered around the bottom. And so I took the tulips, I picked them up and I took them into the office. But before I left, I took a picture of the scene, which is the picture you see now. As I was heading back into the office, I was looking at these beautiful tulips, and I was just thinking to myself, who would throw these flowers away? Who would do that? And I get to the office, and I can't get over it. And so I open up, and I'm looking at the picture, and I'm looking at those tulips, and the cherry blossoms, and I'm thinking, somebody has to save these. And so I go back and I decide I'm going to save the cherry blossoms. And I get to the trash can and I go and I lift out 2 stems. And as I'm doing it, right, the whole trash can falls over. And I'm horrified. I'm like, no, but it was so beautiful, right? And I'm wearing this brand new leather jacket. And I don't care. I hug that New York City trash can and I lift it back up. But the cherry blossoms, they were lopsided, but in the process, I'd managed to pull out a couple of stems, and I trekked back to the office. And I'm sitting there, and I open up the picture, and I'm looking at it again, and I happen to notice a hashtag at the bottom. And I was like, huh. So I open up Instagram, and I type in the hashtag, and I realized that nobody had actually thrown these flowers away. This was a public art installation. I was horrified. I was pretty down on myself. I actually started crying. It's like, who would do this? So I did what any sort of reasonable Liz would do in this situation, and I emailed Lewis Miller, the artist, and I told on myself. And this is what I said. I said, I find myself completely overwhelmed, both by the beauty and by the misguided nature of my instinct. And I hope that this serves as a reminder to me, a disability advocate, that not all things need saving. Sometimes they just need to exist. The world has taught us that a disabled body is nothing more than a body in need of intervention, right? And this is exactly what designers do. We design interventions. We dedicate our careers to it. We are here today because of our commitment to this process. We are seekers who develop our skills with rigor because there's a certain glory in being a designer. We oftentimes want to be the best. And so I see the natural progression. Of course, we're going to want to take our highly attuned skills and apply them to something that we think needs fixing. But I'm someone who straddles both sides. I am a disabled designer. And while solutions feel fulfilling to me as a designer, as a disabled person, this process feels destructive. It feels like we have become a project or a topic instead of a discipline or a craft. Where is the rigor? Design schools are beginning to offer accessibility curriculum, but in lieu of creativity, students are learning about disability through compliance checklists. But that's not design. Design is art, right? It's art with rules. And if accessibility is the rules, where's the art? This is actually where I come in, right? Because the art is in the disability culture. It's in the history. It's in the theory. It's in the knowledge. People don't realize that disability is something a person can feel passion for and endeavor in. Disability can be a practice, a creative practice. But design schools aren't fostering relationships with people who engage in disability as a creative practice. And so a culture is being created where students don't think that they need to build real relationships with actual disabled people. They think that they just need to feel empathy for us. And while it's not their fault, it does need to be said that this empathy leads to the creation of what I like to call disability dongles. So what is a disability dongle? It's a well-intended and elegant yet useless solution to a problem we never knew we had. Disability dongles are most frequently conceived of and created in design schools and at IDEO. You know, I've had the opportunity to do a lot of talks, and it used to be a lot of fun to just get on a stage and rag on large companies and just say, look, like, you know, you don't realize it, but you're inadvertently messing up. But lately, I've actually been feeling a bit sad about it all, because even when they know, nothing changes. My relationship with IDEO, or lack thereof, started about a year ago, a little over a year ago, in the era of the flowers, when they invited me to come into their office. They said they wanted to show me something, so I go there and they show me. They say, we created a technology that is intended to get disabled people hired. And I said, great. What disabled people did you hire to create this technology that's intended to get disabled people hired? And they were like, none. They didn't realize that they were reifying the very stigmas they had sought out to ease. They still don't realize that inviting some disabled creatives to their office for some networking cocktails might do a whole hell of a lot more than some grand gesture of a website. And the reason they don't realize it is because we're disabled. And so therefore, we are users and testers instead of designers and decision makers. We don't get to pick the imagery, we are the imagery. For their website, for the brochures, for their fundraising materials. And it's funny, like, even if we did get invited to their office for cocktails, they'd probably just take pictures of us. It's actually what happened to me during my first interaction with AIGA. So they had a request for proposals. They had a question and answer session for this RFP for an inclusion grant, and I wanted to learn more, and I showed up. And there were about a dozen of us, a variety of diverse people in the room, and there was a professional photographer, which felt a little awkward to me. And about halfway into the session, I realized the photographer had honed in on me because he could see a picture of my cane. And so I took my cane and I hid it behind me. And all of a sudden I saw the photographer sort of creeping around back, and I was like, oh, right, so I had to hide my cane under the table. After a while, I got frustrated and I got up to leave. But unlike my experience with IDEO, AIGA leadership, they followed me and they stopped me before I reached the exit, right? And they emailed me the next day, and the next, right? And it wasn't just one person, it was many. And now I'm here, I suppose, to say thank you. Anyway, say you're a professor with no experience in disability. How would you grade your student's disability project? Would you grade it based on how it's experienced by the disabled person? And how would you even know how it's experienced? Or is there a chance that you might get caught up in your students' well-meaning intentions? In my experience, most teachers do the latter. Now, what's going to happen when that same student approaches you and says they want to learn how to engage in disability as a creative practice? Who do you refer them to for guidance? What are the best practices and where are the resources? This is why it's absolutely essential to insert disability studies curriculum into design schools. Accessibility is only one part of disability. It's the how. Disability studies is the who, it's the what, it's the when, the where, and the why. To be short, disability studies prevents disability dongles. And this is why it's so important for all of us to engage in disability as a creative practice. I feel like some of you might be asking yourselves, like, how did she pick the word dongle, right? Like, you could have any word. And the truth of the matter is I didn't pick it. Some designer somewhere was like, we need a word, okay, that'll do, right? And then other designers are like, yeah, that describes the thing, we'll use that. And so it's become this word that designers use all while doing everything that they can to avoid saying the word disability. Right? I'm not talking about a diversity dongle or a differently abled dongle or an adaptive dongle or an accessible dongle. No, I'm talking about a disability dongle. So how do you begin to engage in disability as a creative practice? Well, you question what you think you know. And this is the way I got started was by creating a new design methodology that I call design questioning. So design questioning is my response to design thinking, which, as many of you know, was an approach to design that was created in the 1960s, right, by white men who really have no equals, right? So these were men who were at the top of their professions. They were aligned with many of the greatest institutions in the world, and they were creating products that filled the homes of millions of people all over the world. And they started realizing that design wasn't reaching everybody, and so they created a system to fill in the gaps, right? They created design thinking. And while much good has come of design thinking, it has inadvertently fueled the narrative that we are recipients rather than drivers of design. And so this is what design questioning does, right? It looks at design thinking from the user's perspective, because when we're finally able to question the systems that disable us, everybody involved stops seeing our bodies as the problem. So let's look at design thinking through the lens of design questioning. So step one of design thinking is you cultivate empathy through observations and interviews. But to a disabled person, this can oftentimes feel a little bit less like empathy and a little bit more like designers are gleaning our ideas and our life hacks so that they can sell them back to us as inspirational do-good without ever giving us credit, right? It reminds me of the story of Betsy Farber. So do you guys know OXO kitchen products at all, right? They're these great kitchen products with these gummy tactile handles. The gummy tactile handle was actually invented by my mentor, Tucker Veermeister, who I sit across from in the office. And so I had grown accustomed, right? Like OXO has become the universal example of universal design. If you go on the OXO website, what you'll see is a story that says Sam Farber saw that his wife was having a hard time peeling a carrot, right? And so he made an easier peeler for her to use because of her arthritis. I had heard this story time and again, and so one day I finally asked Tucker, I said, Tucker, can you tell me about Sam's wife, Betsy? And Tucker said, oh, yeah. He's like, did you know she was a designer? I said, no, I did not know she was a designer. He was like, yeah. He was like, she was around all the time. And I was like, oh, okay. And I started thinking about it, and I realized I don't know a single designer who would just inspirationally let her husband make her a better peeler. And so I decided to pick up the phone and I called Betsy, and the first thing she says to me is I'm going to go down in history as being Sam's lowly crippled wife, and it was actually my idea in the first place. So that's step one. I think about this stuff too much. So you have our insights gleaned, and you enter step two of the design thinking process, which is defining the problem, right? But because disabled people are never allowed to lead, it often at times becomes us that's defined as the problem rather than the problem being defined as the problem, right? It becomes about what we can or can't do rather than how something does or doesn't work for us, right? So you've got our insights gleaned, we're defined as the problem, and then designers enter this iterative process of ideation, prototyping, and testing, and they eventually land at what I call the unacknowledged sixth step of design thinking, or as I call it, design thanking, because we're expected to be for that what's been done for us. And the truth of the matter is since I've started this process, I've actually gotten a bit more out of design questioning than I actually ever really have out of design thinking. I'm going to tell you a story about Thyssen. So 2 years ago, I was at South by Southwest, and three things happened. The first thing that happened is I knew in advance that I was going to have some deaf friends that I really admire who were going to be there. So I asked for an interpreter for my panel. And when I showed up, there was no interpreter. And I was pissed. But it was fine because they didn't actually arrive until the next day. So the next day, I decided to go to their panel. And I don't know if you guys know much about deaf culture, but when deaf people are speaking, deaf people show up. And so I arrived at their panel, 2 deaf people and 2 non-deaf people on the panel, no interpreter. The only interpreter was the one that Jenny Leigh Fleury, the chief accessibility officer from Microsoft, had flown in with her from Seattle. And so her back was facing the audience so that Jenny could read what she was saying. And at the end of the panel, when the question and answer session happened, someone took a mic, and the very first question was, where's the interpreters? And while I was there, somebody next to me said, oh, there's a really interesting panel after this on phantom pain. Do you want to go with me? And I have sensory issues, and I thought it might be interesting, so I said yes. And when I got there, I found out the name of the panel. It was called End of Disability. And I was horrified because they wouldn't have an end of women panel. They wouldn't have an end of gay people panel. Why are people always trying to get rid of us? And so I took the mic and I said as much. And somebody happened to be in the audience, and it happened to make the rounds on disability Twitter, and it ended up prompting Hugh Forrest, who's the director of South by Southwest, to reach out. And we get on this phone, and we're having this amazing conversation where we're basically taking turns creatively telling each other how much we hate each other. And I finally tell him, I'm like, I'm going to make a technology that's going to shed light on your accessibility failures. And he said, fine, do it. And I said, fine, and I hung up. And I was like, shit. So I'm in this new office where I'm a fellow, and I was pacing around. And this guy, I was pissed, and this guy approaches me in the kitchen, and he's like, what are you doing here? I was like, what are you talking about? I was like, what are you doing here? And I was like, what are you talking about? And he said, you weren't at South by, were you? I was like, yeah. He's like, you weren't at an end of disability panel, were you? And I was like, yeah. He's like, oh my God, like, you totally blew my mind. He's like, that night when I went home, the only thing I told my wife was what you said. He's like, it left an impression on me. And I was like, great. He's like, what are you doing here? And I said, well, a mentor of mine told me I should come and work in this space as a fellow. I said, what are you doing here? And he said, well, I'm the head of product. And I said, well, that's great, because I just got off the phone with Hugh Forrest, and I told him I was going to make this technology, and I have no idea how to do it. So I told him what it is. It's simple. It's a live speech-to-text app that uses Google's API, their speech-to-text API. But what we do is in the audience, we crowdsource corrections for errors. So in the case that an interpreter doesn't show up, at least the disabled person would have a way to access what's going on in any event on their phone. And it was really fascinating. So he helped me actually build a demo. He's like, yeah, that's easy. So we built a demo, and I get asked 2 weeks later by Google Creative Lab if I could come speak before an internal hackathon they had. And so I went and I spoke, and I used the opportunity to tell them about my idea, and I showed them the demo, and they're like, that's great, we want to build the back end. And so they built the back end, and they gave me a grant, and I found a team, and I built it, and 2 years later, I launched it a few weeks ago at South by Southwest, right? Thank you. And we're actually going to be testing it out tomorrow in the business and entrepreneurship sessions if you want to test it out. It's just, you just download the app Thyssen, and even if you're not in those sessions, you can sort of see it in real time if you're elsewhere. But the thing is this thing that was just a fuck you, right? It turned into something. And now I realize, like, okay, well, now I made my point, and now I can start to make some other points. And so there's things I'm thinking about, right? And one of the things I'm thinking about is my frustration with companies that decide that they're going to hire disabled people, right? When they talk about us, they do so through the lens of empathy, right? Like, oh, we empathetically hired these lowly disabled people, right? Well, I want to be the company, right? I want to get money. I want to be the company that goes out and poaches your disabled talent, right? Like, I want to be that asshole, right? Because we deserve to be treated competitively. And so there's these ways in which I was never expecting it, but I found myself wildly empowered. But then there's other ways where I feel like my empowerment is sort of being stripped from me, right? So I think about, so my team, right? It's me and it's 3 people that don't identify as disabled, and I struggle with that, right? I think this product is deserving of a disabled founding team. But then I realized if it was me and 3 other disabled people and we went into a VC's office and we tried to raise some capital, we'd probably get a whole lot less than what we're worth, and the VC would feel inspiration and empathy and pat himself on the back for his good deed. So long as I have 3 people who aren't disabled around me, I feel like I have a greater chance of protecting myself. And that's not fair. And I think this is really what I spend a lot of my time doing, is sort of strategically thinking about how, and this is how it always plays out in disability, right? The things that we radically fight for turn into things that are empathetically done for us. It makes me think about national adapt, right? So in Denver in the early 1970s, there was what is called the Gang of 19. And it's 19 people, 19 disabled people who had escaped institutions. And this was the first time after industrialization that disabled people had found themselves out of institutions, and they quite simply had to escape. And so there was 19 people in Denver who were now out in the world. And they looked radical, right? People had never seen these bodies before. And they wanted something radical. They wanted access in the form of bus lifts on buses. And they went about it in a really radical way, right? They parked their bodies in front of buses and in intersections. And at the time, right, the society was frightened. They wanted to look away. But things evolved, and suddenly these bodies seemed a little less radical, right? And then suddenly their ideas seemed a little less radical. And then suddenly people were like, yeah, buses should come with bus lifts. And suddenly buses did start coming with bus lifts. And then when the 1990s rolled around, it was so powerful that when the ADA was finally written, bus lifts were written into the ADA. And in the disability community, we oftentimes look at this and we think of it as a profound success. But I actually see something a little bit different. The very moment that bus lifts were written pen to paper into the ADA, disabled people were no longer needed in the thing that they fought so valiantly for, right? Now bus lifts were something that were empathetically done for disabled people. And it's not just National Adapt. So I created something called the Witte Fellowship, where I partner creative disabled people with top design studios and creative spaces. And the reason I chose the word with was because if you Google the phrase design for disability, what you'll see is that it yields more than twice as many search results as disability design. This idea that we are recipients of design has embedded itself into our language, even though we are responsible for the internet. We created email, we created the bicycle, we created cruise control, curb cuts, the electric toothbrush, the iPhone touchscreen, and more, right? Our ingenuity changes the world, and yet we are perceived as recipients. So I created the Witte Fellowship. And more often than not, when companies turn to me to ask about the Witte Fellowship, they say to me, oh, so you're talking about co-design. And I say, no, I'm not talking about co-design at all. With is the antithesis of co-design. So what's the difference? Well, in co-design, it's the institutions that get to decide when and how disabled people are involved, but with is us inserting ourselves into the process. And so earlier I was telling you about that AIGA RFP. I do want to let you know that I actually ended up winning the grant from that call for proposals for the Witte Fellowship. So thank you, AIGA. And so, you know, there's these ways in which my thinking has progressed over the last few years, but where I'm actually really at now is trying to figure out, how does a person actually fight back against empathy, right? How do you do that, right? And I think to actually answer this, you have to understand what empathy is, right? So empathy is a term, it's only 110 years old. It was coined in 1909. It was brought to America after, so there was this psychologist in Germany, his name was Theodor Lipps. So he was friends with Rilke and Rodin, right? He was Freud's mentor. And what he saw is that when a person enters a museum and they encounter a great work of art, that person, they might tug at their collar, or they might put their hand on their chest and step back, or they might sway. What he saw is that people are physically moved by works of great human expression, and so he developed a term that he called Einfühlung. And that's what it meant, physically moved by works of great human expression. And then some time passes, and it makes its way to America after taking off in Germany. And when it lands in America in the form of empathy, it shifts, and it no longer means physically moved by works of great human expression. And now it means feeling sympathy, or as we disabled people experience it, pity for another person's situation or circumstance, right? And so and this is the thing that I get so caught up in, is as empathy shifted from inspiration to pity, at the same time, disability was shifting from pity to inspiration. And I think in this process, I think all of us have lost the ability to parse out one emotion from the other. And so I think about, what does it mean then when we are unable to parse out these emotions, and yet they are the core of what we're doing in design? And I realize there's 3 outcomes. The first is that disability reifies class and power structures, right? So you always have the empathizer, and then you have the empathizee. The empathizer ends up becoming a savior in this situation, right? They get to tell the story. We never hear from the empathizee. The second is it prescribes emotions, right? Like empathy, like we're so focused on making things feel a certain way that we've forgotten to actually make things that do a certain thing. And I've actually come to believe that we're so focused on this that it is actually, trying to make something feel like empathy is actually preventing us from doing the things that we've set out to do. And the last thing is that it silences the recipient. The word empathy is frequently used in conjunction with a concept that's been kind of growing as of late, this idea of design for all, where it's presumed where if you design something for a disabled person, everybody is going to benefit. But if you actually really closely look at like when and how it's used, what you would realize is that it's really nothing more than virtue signaling. It's no different than empathy. And I know it makes all of us uncomfortable, but we need to start thinking critically about things we perceive as wholesome, because they're a whole lot more complex than we ever give ourselves, allow ourselves to think. So I want to take a moment to talk about this idea of universality, right? Design for all. When we design for disability, everybody benefits. So disability did not exist before industrialization, right? So you might have me with my cane, you might have a deaf person, and you might have a blind person existing in their communities, contributing as they could. But they were never grouped together as this thing, right? They were viewed as separate. So what happened was industrialization rolled around, and it created this expectation that bodies could perform in rote and mechanized ways. And suddenly there was a subset of bodies that couldn't. And so industry at the time turned to doctors and philosophers to diagnose those bodies medically as disabled. Those bodies were then segregated and institutionalized. And so it strikes me as so fascinating that the very thing that created us in the first place, this expectation of mass and normal and universality, is the very thing that we turn to, all these decades later to try and actually solve it, mass and normal and universality. We're trying so hard to fix disability that we can't actually see when we're actually reifying it and recreating it. And so my question is what would happen instead if instead of trying to smooth out disability, we instead developed the capacity to acknowledge and appreciate the friction of it, right? I want to be able to honor the friction of my disability. My work is not universal, but it's also not niche. And I like to think if design can start investing in disabled bodies instead of trying to fix us, this work can be expansive. We are designers. As children, we might realize we have a knack for this work, but we don't just think we can do it, right? No, we go to school and we develop our skill set with rigor, and then we graduate and we continue education and we end up at events like this one here today. And yet somehow we're the very people that when it comes to disability, we think we just know, but we don't. I woke up 7 years and 5 days ago to a new body. And I have spent the last 7 years and 5 days unlearning everything I know about disability. And I have now reached a point where the word disability and the word design have become synonymous to me. They mean the same thing. One is the result of the other, one informs the other. And so I'm left wondering, when are we going to start to engage the other side of design? Thank you.
That was so good.
I think I just did something to my mic, but it makes sounds still.
It still makes sounds. We're good.
Yeah.
So I have something very specific to ask you. Maybe you in the audience have seen a few of these going around. These guys. You are responsible for these.
There we go.
Tell me about this project.
So I'm a troll. And there's something so hilarious to me, because there is this tension between disability and design that I'm not sure if everybody here is aware of, but design hates Comic Sans. Like, you guys hate it. And yet in disability, this is a more legible font, right? It's true. People find that it's a much easier to read font. And so, I think it's I find it to be this sort of visual example of what it is that we're sort of experiencing in both disability and design. And so what I thought would be really interesting is I wanted to challenge brands to make a Comic Sans version of their logo as a statement that you are engaging in disability as a creative practice. And so given my experiences with AIGA and how they've been open to working with me, I decided I was just going to do it for them. And it's hilarious, because I took, the first person I showed it to was like, well, the kerning. I was like, but I don't gotta, right? And so there you go. And so, I'm hopeful that, brands might be willing to make a statement that, not everything needs to be fixed. Maybe we can just engage a little bit. So that's the story behind it.
So in that spirit, we made a 99% Invisible logo in Comic Sans right there. It's gorgeous. And so we want it would be really fun over the course of the weekend to like make a Comic Sans version of your logo and know that you're like thinking about this stuff. And
Hashtag Comic Sans Takeover.
And then put it up online, Comic Sans Takeover,
Yeah.
and see if you can really engage with the ideas. I was just thinking about the Betsy Farber story, and like I'm a professional storyteller, and there's no reason why the story you found out is a worse story to tell than the other one.
Yeah.
So why do you think that one's still the one perpetuated on the OXO website and not the one that you found out?
Well, I think I ended up writing a piece in the New York Times about it.
Yeah.
And I thought after I wrote that piece, OXO would actually correct the story. But instead they've doubled down. And I think this is the case with a lot of things. I think there is a certain way that we like to tell stories of disability. I think we like to have a savior as the protagonist. And I know you've sort of encountered this a little bit on your podcast, because you've done podcasts on the curb cut and stuff, right? So there's this term in disability, it's called inspiration porn. I feel like there's a lot of porn like happening on stage today.
That's the way we like it.
But I think it's that people like to be very inspired by disabled people, and it really prevents us from kind of realizing what are the true stories behind this. And so, I've really taken an interest in uncovering a lot of these histories. So I often tell the story. Does anybody here use Fingerworks?
I don't know if it works.
Really? So in 1998, there's this guy, his name's Wayne Westerman, and he had some carpal tunnel and some tendinitis, and he wanted to figure out if there was a way he could continue working. And so he developed this thing called Fingerworks, and then in 2005, Steve Jobs bought it. It's the iPhone touchscreen, right? So who here uses Fingerworks? This is the thing is there are disabled people behind so many stories, between so many objects that we encounter every day, and they just get written out of history. And so I've been really working to try and uncover a lot of these histories. There's so many of them.
That's fantastic. Liz Jackson, everybody.